my throne, just as I was victorious and sat down with my Father on his throne. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. All right. Now, being this the last church, it's interesting how I've said a lot of content, I've said a lot of information, said a lot of things about all the other churches in the past, all the previous churches 1 through 6, talking about how increasingly the promises grow, how most of them have positives, and most of them have positives and negatives. Some have only positives, some have only negatives, and how the promises increase, but as so does the sin, and so does the spiritual decline. It's the bad spiritual condition. Now, what's interesting to me is the Church of Laodicea, while it is the most talked about out of the 7 churches because of its relevance to today, to Christians and Seventh-day Adventists who exist in modern time, but it also so happens to have the most, I would say, depth in terms of how many references, and often we just focus on the hot and cold, but how much, as I've mentioned before, Jesus is tailoring each of these letters to each of the individual churches. He understands their context, how he can write it in a way that will connect with them. But this letter to the Church of Laodicea is on almost an entirely different level. Every single one of the lines in here has so much reference, so much parallel, and I can't wait to unpack that. So just here are some quick facts, as I've been doing, just so to broaden your knowledge about these real places that existed. Laodicea is what would be today modern Eskhisar, Turkey, which, as I said, they get progressively further from the Isle of Patmos, 45 miles southeast of Philadelphia, to be specific. And just like many of them, all these churches had interesting locations and very specific and intentional locations, and many of them tended to be along trade routes. And the Church of Laodicea is no different. It was on a major trade route between Ephesus and Syria, but because of its location specifically, it became what it had become one, if not the greatest commercial and financial center of the entire ancient world. So we in the Seventh-day Adventist world know it for being, the last church, the last people of the end times. But even back in that time, it was a very famous and very well-known, respected, and influential place, if not one of the most out of the 7 churches. Because it was on this famous trade route and an important trade route, it had enormous wealth, as the text kind of implies. Its wealth, for those who don't know, came from mostly clothing manufacturing, such as rugs, such as cloths, such as furs and all that sort of thing, and made a lot of its profits out of that, as well as bank transactions. It had become a banking center where a lot of money had been stored. It had stored vast and large quantities of gold. So when it talks about you are rich, in the book of Revelation, it's not kidding. It was truly a rich church, a rich city. They were so prosperous. They not only were they rich just in money, but also in its influence and its regard. They actually were famous for its medical school. I hadn't known that until recent researching, but they had a very famous medical school, and they were famous specifically for their treatment of eye diseases. They would mix these spices, or not spices, but I can't remember the exact name of the thing they combine it with, but they would combine things with this oil, and it would become this salve that would be put on the eyes, which, if you heard me just now, sounds a lot like some of the stuff we've read in Revelation. Again, because Jesus is very intentional with his audience, that they would immediately get the reference and what he's playing off of. And those are things that we're going to get into in just very little bit. Now, like I said, they were so incredibly wealthy. I can't I can't oversell it. They were just so wealthy. They had stores, and they were a bank center, and held so much quantities of gold. And because of that, because they were so wealthy, it filled them with so much pride. And there's a famous story about Laodicea and its history, that when it was devastated in AD 60 by an earthquake, right? They had the whole city, and not just them, but many cities were hit by the same earthquake in AD 60. But Laodicea specifically, uniquely, when they were hit, when the entire city was devastated, they refused imperial help. They refused the government's help. They refused it because they were so prideful, because they said, we don't need your money. We don't need help. We are fine. We can do it on our own. So they actually rebuilt the entire city, all on their own resources. That's the extent of their pride. So when the Bible says, when Revelation says, Revelation chapter 3 says that they are prideful, in need of nothing, it really means it. It's not some, oh, you are content. No. These are people who are more than content and have more than they could ever need. They don't need help. And help was not option. A lot of the churches we've looked at before were small. A lot of churches were a small community, we're a weak community. Laodicea is the entire opposite of all of these churches. They are not weak whatsoever. They are wealthy, empowered. They're not being, as you notice, and I'm gonna get more into the text real soon. But as you notice in the text, it doesn't have a sort of they don't have a pagan culture or sort of thing that it's at least saying about in the text that's forcing them back. No, Laodicea is rich and prosperous, and that is their biggest problem. The big problem in terms of the city, and this plays a lot into the text, is very important in the text, is their biggest problem as a city was water. Notice the famous line that we talk about is, you are neither hot nor cold. Well, that's for a very good reason. In Laodicea, they actually had this 6-mile long aqueduct, this thing connecting to the water source in Hierapolis. Again, I don't know if I can pronounce all these correct. But so they had a water source from Hierapolis as well as Colossae, or however you pronounce it. But what's interesting is the water from Hierapolis were hot springs, and the water that would come from Colossae was cool water because of the different climates and where they were at. But because the aqueduct and because the water sources were so far, even though the water they got from Hierapolis was hot and the water that they got from Colossae was cold, by the time it got to the city, by the time it got to the people, it was, you guessed it, lukewarm. And I think that's so mind-blowing about how Jesus, how personal he is with the people he's talking to, that they would immediately get that reference, because that's the lukewarm water is a big problem for the church. And now Jesus is using that to say, your water is lukewarm, but so are you. Okay, now getting into the message, and we're getting more into that. As I said, every church has its own presentation, but it is a sampled presentation of what we saw at the beginning of Revelation. To Laodicea, Jesus presents himself as the Amen, the faithful, the true witness, the beginning of God's creation. Amen being true, the faithful, the true witness, and he knows all. And it's kind of self-explanatory, but as we go on to the next part, again, Laodicea is not the only one, but it is uniquely the only church that not only has no positives whatsoever, showing how bad the spiritual condition of the church, that they have zero positives, no praises at all for Laodicea, but also that they don't have, it's not attributed to any heresy or any sin or apostasy. There's not something egregious that they did. There's not something that they committed that in all the other churches, even those that had no praise, Jesus points out that, oh, it's the synagogue of Satan, or it's Jezebel, the people following Jezebel. There's a reason, and there's a group who are defactoring. But in Laodicea, it's the entire people, it's the entire church. There's no praises, but there is also no one issue. They all share the same issue, and that is of course, lukewarmness. As I just mentioned earlier, he's referring to the water that they have, the problem of water being lukewarm in the city. No refreshingly cold water or comfortingly hot water. They're just lukewarm. He's saying, just like this water that is unappealing and unsatisfactory, so are you people to me. I wish to spit you out and vomit you. You are like this lukewarm water. I can't do anything with it. Again, unlike Smyrna, for example, showing parallels between the other churches who were materially poor. The Smyrna was a small church and was materially poor, but they were praised for being spiritually rich, for holding on, for remaining. Whereas Laodicea is the entire opposite. They are completely wealthy, they are prosperous, but on the opposite side of the spectrum, they have the worst rebuke. They are the most spiritually poor. Again, it says, you say, I am rich, I've acquired wealth, and do not need a thing, but you do not realize that you are wretched, pitiful, poor, blind, and naked. Some of these words are very interesting in pointing out when you go to the Greek. For example, when it says, when you are poor, it's not just poor, it's a word, the word is tukos, which means it's denoting or implying extreme poverty. So he's not just saying you are spiritually poor, you are in poverty with your spirituality. I think that's something really cool. Another word I wanted to point out is the word for blind, which is typhlos, which basically, which is kind of self-explanatory that they're blind, but it's pointing out that they are blind specifically to their condition. They are blind to themselves. They are blind to what they are doing. But what is ironic, again, so much to unpack in this letter specifically, is, as I mentioned before, if remember I said about the history of the church, is that they were famous for what? They were famous, as I mentioned, if you were paying attention, to the eye balm. They were famous for their eye treatment. And the people whose fame was built on treating eyes, they're the ones who are spiritually blind. Isn't that powerful? He's showing those who are extremely rich, and they're extremely in poverty when it comes to spirituality. Those who are famous and well known and have their influence and make their cash and their wealth from treating people's eyes are the most blind when it comes to their spiritual condition. And again, a very intentional Jesus message, as with all the other churches, but I would argue that Laodicea has the most references, I would say, as if you couldn't already tell. Specifically, he tells them to buy from him, to buy three things from him. The three things, before we get to three things, notice he says to buy it. He says to buy it. Whereas with the other churches, these are things they ought to do, they need to do. He's calling them to do. But for Laodicea specifically, he tells them, you need to buy it from me. You have to give something to me. That's the first church that doesn't have to hold on or that doesn't have to remember. This is a church that actually has to give something specifically to Jesus, because this church has a condition where they have to actually, in order for them to turn back from their ways, they have to give something up. They have to make sacrifices of themselves, maybe even physically, materially. This church's condition is due to the fact that they have so much and are so wealthy and so content. But so for this church, Jesus is saying, no, it's not free for you, because for you, everything is available. No, for you to come to me, you have to buy from me. It's going to cost you something for you to gain everything. Three things that is mentioned in the text is gold refined in fire, many times referred throughout the Bible, which means basically that a faith that is not only tested and tried, but also one that lasts. So a faith that is tested as well as a faith that lasts. So he says, that's the first thing you need to buy from me. The second thing is white garments. to cover them, basically to cover them with Christ's righteousness. In other words, their character, their lukewarmness, their complacency, all those sort of things, their lack of spiritual condition can't be done on their own. Again, it must cost them something. It must cost them themselves, giving up this appearance, giving up this material, giving up this pride, and covering it with the humbleness and the righteousness of Jesus. Which interestingly later is specifically these same white garments are the white garments that are given to the last day Christians later in Revelation. I believe it's Revelation 16, who are preparing for the Armageddon, for the doomsday, for the end of times. So this same white garments that Laodicea needs is the same white garments later in Revelation that the people in the last days need. And then finally, the third one, again, being very intentional, to the Laodiceans who are famous for their eye salve, for their eye treatments, who are now blind. Jesus is saying the third thing you need to buy from me is eye salve to anoint your eyes. In other words, you need to buy from me the real treatment. I'm the real doctor. You think with all your medical schools and degrees. No, you guys aren't the real doctor. I'm the true doctor. And I'm telling you, your real condition is blind. And let me buy from me the only eye salve that can anoint your eyes to see how bad it's gotten. To refer to a text that points this out very well, Psalms chapter 119, verse 18 says, "Open my eyes that I may behold." So the same thing Jesus is asking to them is buy from me, give up what you have, and so you can buy from me. I know it's going to cost a lot, but it's going to be worth it. Is give up what you have so that your eyes may be opened and you can behold the great things which I have for you. And then as he portrays himself towards the end of the text, we see where it talks about Laodicea being loved by Jesus. Now, Laodicea isn't the only church that gets this message. There's also the Church of Philadelphia, which we went over last week. But interestingly enough, or if you pay attention to how these phrases are used, because it says Laodicea is loved by Jesus and Philadelphia is loved by Jesus. But Philadelphia has love for Jesus that is in the positive, that is in the good. But even in the text, he says, "For those who I love, I rebuke and I discipline." So this isn't the warm, comforting, "I'm proud of you" love that he's giving to the Church of Philadelphia. No, this is still love, but it is on the opposite side of love, which is the love that rebukes, the love that has to rebuke, and the love that has to discipline. It is a rebukeful love and a disciplinary love. Same thing with parenting. Jesus is being a stern parent here, is where, it can't always be nice all the time because it spoils his children, it spoils the child. So now this church needs rebuke and discipline so that they don't fall into the upcoming destruction. He portrays himself as the one, he calls himself the one standing at the door and knocking. And what this reminds you of, at least if you have the mindset of Scripture, is the lover in the book of Song of Songs or the Song of Solomon, depending on, again, what version. But in that book, you have this character, the lover, who's knocking at his beloved's door, pleading to be let in. He's trying, and this is an intimate moment in the book of Song of Songs. So here in this connection, or in this parallel, Jesus is saying, "I am standing at the door ready for you. I'm actually pleading for you to let me in," as one who wants to have a loving and intimate relationship and close relationship with you. I want to become close. I want us to be open with each other again. It's very tender. It's very loving. Even though there's the stern rebuke, it's immediately followed with this warm and intimate and compassionate Jesus. And what a beautiful picture. And finally, as I mentioned in the past, also, there's the promises that he says is that that they will sit on the throne with him. So, as I mentioned already in the first chapter of Revelation, is the sitting on the throne, and I showed you that the pattern is as we go through each of the churches, you have one promise, then two promises, then three, then four, then five, then six, and then when we get to the final one, the seventh one, Laodicea, it doesn't increase. There's only the one promise. The only promise is that they will sit on the throne with him and share his victory. And as I mentioned, I kind of already spoiled it when we went over in the first chapter, but sitting on the throne with Jesus encompasses all the other promises. So to the church who has the biggest issue, the biggest problem, Jesus is giving the biggest blessing, which shows a lot about the kind of grace and the kind of God that we serve, or the kind of Jesus that is already being portrayed. Only the third chapter of Revelation is he's showing that even as far as you've gone from being one that I wanted to vomit, I wanted to spew out. This is for sure the most biggest rebuke Jesus has given out of all the churches, and yet he gives them the totality of all the blessings in one. And of course, Laodicea is the church today. Seeing from implications we see out of the text, we today are in that period. We are in the church of Laodicea. We are witnessing the church of Laodicea before. I was researching through some of the books I'm going through for this series, and something that I talked about when it came to Laodicea in our generation and the time we're living in. How is Laodicea connected to today's time? This is what I pulled from there. Laodicea is a church that lives in a peculiar time and is constantly battling political, religious, and secular issues. More particularly, it faces unique challenges that were not faced by the previous generations, while at the same time being the most self-sufficient of all of them. And I thought that was very interesting the way they worded it. Is on one end, it has unique challenges that were not faced by previous generation. In other words, the issue, as we see with Laodicea, they are its own in their own league. Laodicea has an issue that, as we talked about, many of the churches had parallels with one another and had very similar issues. I think for 3 weeks straight, I felt like a broken record because each church had similar issues, pagans everywhere. But here with Laodicea, the issue is more political. It's more of religious and secular issue. It's more an issue within than without. It's almost eroding from the inside. And there are unique challenges that are not faced by the other churches. Again, it's kind of very, very, very relevant to today's time, of where we have new generations who are born in the informational age and dealing with issues, and the church too are trying to meet those issues that have never really been dealt with or had to have been dealt with before. While at the same time, I like the way they put this, while at the same time being the most self-sufficient of all of them. The young people in this generation all has phones. The amount of information that is accessed and the amount of accessibility that that this generation has is unlike any other generation could ever believe or dreamed. And just like Laodicea, has that worked in favor or positively to the spiritual environment of the people, or in the negative? And that's the main issues dealing with Laodicea. My final point, and the last thing I want to leave off with you, because I just wanted to share with you all that stuff, because I think all those references in Laodicea are often missed, and I think were really cool. So I hope you took notes and see Laodicea even more with broader eyes and bigger eyes. But the final point is the main point that Jesus draws is the lukewarmness and why it is lukewarm. Remember, why Laodicea's water was lukewarm is because their sources of water was so far away. If it was from Hierapolis, it was hot. but by the time it got to the church, it was lukewarm. When it was in Colossae, it was cold, but as it travels 6 miles down to the church, it too becomes lukewarm. The message here is, there's two parts that they could go. The source of water, the source of life is so far away that as it finally gets to the place it's needed, it's no longer useful. It's no longer efficient. That's what creates this complacency, this pridefulness, as the Laodiceans say, is that I have no need for nothing. And so it's a very simple message that has been ringing throughout all the churches, but is stay close to the source. Don't keep your source of water, your source of life far away from you. Keep it close to your heart. When you keep it 6 miles away, when you just leave it on Saturday, when you just leave it at the church and you don't bring it with you, your source of water is only 1 out of 7 days of the week. When your religion, your faith is only 6 miles distant, maybe even further, 6 miles, 100 miles, by the time it gets to you, it is of no use to you. So if you want to avoid being lukewarm, stay close to the source. That is the message for us today in the modern century. Thank you all for joining me on this 7-church journey. If you have any questions in the following week, please send them to Pastor Dan or Uncle Eric or even me directly or in the chat. And we can go maybe furthermore and ask some questions that could be sort of an interactive portion next week. Thank you, everybody. Pastor Dan, back to you.
Thank you, Pastor John. Another beautiful devotional for tonight. And I know you have been all benefited by such a beautiful study tonight. Thank you so much, Pastor John, for how many it is? I think it's a 7 truckload of semis of information we got tonight. Amazing. Thank you.